When the new readings from 3I Atlas arrived, no one in the control rooms reacted at first. A few engineers exchanged glances, someone recalibrated a monitor, and one analyst quietly checked the timestamp on the feed. The numbers didn't make sense. The comet's velocity had changed, subtly but undeniably. At first, it looked like a software error, maybe a cosmic ray hit corrupting the data stream. But as the hours passed and the same readings appeared from instruments on opposite sides of the planet, the reality began to settle in. Something had altered 3I Atlas's course. To anyone outside the astrophysics community, that might sound trivial, but for those who've spent years modeling celestial mechanics, it was like watching gravity stop working. Comets don't accelerate on command. Their motion is written by sunlight, by ice vaporizing into space, by ancient orbits traced from billions of years ago. They cannot decide to change direction, and yet here was an object doing exactly that, smoothly, precisely, and without any visible jet activity. The first official response came from a European observatory, a short measured statement about anomalous momentum variation likely due to uneven outgassing. But inside the data teams, nobody believed that explanation. There were no visible vents, no plumes, and the acceleration pattern repeated at perfect intervals, as though someone somewhere was issuing tiny, timed corrections. In the following days, independent astronomers confirmed the same pattern. Every 11 hours and 42 minutes, the object shifted slightly, never enough to suggest propulsion, but too deliberate to be random. Then came a second anomaly. The reflected light spectrum, normally stable for an icy body, began to drift between organic signatures and metallic ones. One night, it read like frozen carbon, the next like refined iron. Even under the best atmospheric conditions, that kind of fluctuation shouldn't exist. By the end of the week, the discussion had turned from curiosity to quiet alarm, because if 3I Atlas wasn't being moved by nature, then something, or someone, was influencing it. Inside NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the data analysts were told to stop referring to the object as a comet in official memos. Its new designation simply read 3I Atlas, anomalous body, interstellar origin. Teams were instructed to rerun every model from scratch. They tested for dust jets, for rotational torque, for magnetic coupling, for every known cosmic mechanism that might explain a self-correction. None fit. The equations refused to balance. Meanwhile, small details began slipping into the data feeds. The object's thermal map was unnaturally uniform. No hotspots, no shadows, no signs of rotation. It was as if the entire surface was maintaining a constant temperature in direct sunlight. For the astrophysicists accustomed to messy, chaotic comets, that perfection felt wrong. Then came the signal, faint, rhythmic pulses embedded in the background noise of the radio spectrum, so regular they couldn't be interference. At first, most dismissed them as a cross-feed from a satellite network, but when Japanese and Chilean observatories picked up the same pulses, spaced exactly 11 hours and 42 minutes apart, attention shifted. The signal was tied to the same interval as the object's motion shifts. When the agencies realized this, the public updates stopped. NASA's open data portal went down for scheduled maintenance. ESA's live stream froze on a single frame. The Japanese Space Agency released one more bulletin, then went silent. For the first time in decades, every major space organization watching a single object turned off its cameras at the same time. But the independent observers didn't stop. Amateur astronomers across South America and Europe noticed that 3I Atlas had brightened, not in a flare, but in a slow, controlled way, as though its surface were reconfiguring to reflect more light. Some reported faint halos around it, subtle distortions in the background stars, as if light itself were bending differently near the object. The forums filled with speculation. Could it be a magnetic field? A gravitational anomaly? Something artificial? Scientists, even the cautious ones, began to admit it openly. 3I Atlas was no longer behaving like a comet at all, and yet no one could say what it was. By the time the object neared Mars's orbit, the silence from official channels had become deafening. The last confirmed data stream from NASA showed a residual energy field, weak but measurable, surrounding the body like a faint shell. No natural comet produces that kind of electromagnetic footprint. The models showed it pulsing in harmony with the earlier radio bursts. Some researchers thought it might be static discharge, others whispered about control systems. Whatever the cause, one truth had become impossible to deny. 3i Atlas wasn't following the rules of the solar system, it was writing its own. In the weeks that followed, the official silence grew heavier. No more live data, no new orbital updates, no press conferences. But behind that silence, something was clearly happening. The last confirmed telemetry, leaked from a private tracking node, suggested 3i Atlas had not just changed direction, it had stopped accelerating altogether. The object was now coasting at a steady speed, perfectly synchronized with the orbital drift of Mars, almost as if it had reached the exact point it intended to. For planetary scientists, that idea was unthinkable. Comets don't hover. They fall, they sling, they burn, but they don't align themselves with planetary motion. Yet the mathematics was clear. Its current vector was not random. It was a match, within fractions of a percent, to Mars's orbital period. That level of synchronization would require precise calculation, not coincidence. Inside the European Space Operations Centre, a small group of analysts continued running models despite official restrictions. One of them, an astrophysicist who'd worked on the Rosetta mission years earlier, described what they found as the cleanest non-gravitational correction I've ever seen. When asked what that meant, her only answer was, "It means someone knows exactly what they're doing." Meanwhile, independent radio astronomers in Australia picked up something faint on their wide-field receivers. It wasn't a signal exactly, not in the sense of a transmission, but rather a shifting interference pattern repeating every 11 hours, the same rhythm, the same pulse, except this time it was stronger, more deliberate. When they mapped it visually, it formed what looked like a narrow repeating arc, like a radar sweep, as if the object were scanning space around it. The word active began appearing in private discussions, not in headlines, not in reports, but in the quiet conversations of people who understood what active means when applied to an interstellar visitor. Active means control. Active means purpose. Active means this isn't just another fragment of ancient ice adrift between stars. What unsettled everyone most wasn't what 3i Atlas was doing, it was how little energy it seemed to require to do it. The total power output measured across its emissions was almost zero. No heat plume, no propulsive discharge, no detectable radiation beyond the faint pulse. It was acting without expending measurable effort, as if the energy it used came from something more efficient than physics should allow. In one of the final leaked internal memos from NASA's JPL, a line stood out: "Energy consistency is non-terrestrial." It wasn't a declaration, not even a conclusion, just an observation. But to anyone reading between the lines, it said enough. Then came the image. It wasn't an official release. It came from an optical array in Chile, part of a collaboration that had been quietly continuing long after other agencies pulled back. The array captured 3i Atlas in a deep exposure, its tail gone completely, its body glowing in infrared like a uniform sphere. But surrounding it was something else, a faint geometric outline, symmetrical, angular. At first, analysts thought it was an artifact of the imaging process, but after several reprocessings, the shape remained. A hexagonal halo perfectly centered around the object. To those who've spent lifetimes studying the chaos of natural space bodies, symmetry is unsettling. Nature rarely builds perfect geometry and motion, and yet there it was, precise, stable, and unmoving against the drift of stars. As news of the image spread through quiet academic channels, the conversation shifted from what it was to why it was there. Some thought it could be a magnetic lattice, an electromagnetic shell formed by charged particles. Others whispered about a containment field, a structure invisible except for the faint radiation it emitted. But no matter the theory, they all agreed on one thing. Whatever it was not behaving like a comet. Around the same time, Mars began to show changes too. Instruments from past missions, long dormant, their data still trickling home through relay networks, started detecting faint disturbances in the planet's upper atmosphere, tiny fluctuations in ion density, patterns that repeated in phase with 3i Atlas's pulses. It was as though the object's influence wasn't confined to itself anymore. It was reaching out, altering the space around it. On the surface, nothing seemed out of place. But deep in the telemetry archives, buried in unread lines of code, the numbers began to tell a story. The thin Martian air was vibrating, fractionally, at the same frequency as the object's signal. It wasn't noise, it was resonance. The timing couldn't have been worse. Global observatories were still cut off. Amateur astronomers were reporting strange signal dropouts when they aimed at 3I Atlas's position, as though the object itself was absorbing transmissions. Theories multiplied. Some thought it was creating a distortion field, bending electromagnetic energy around it. Others suggested the object was drawing power from sunlight directly, not through reflection, but conversion. Still, no one could say it aloud. The possibility that it was doing all of this deliberately. Weeks passed. Then, in the early hours of a quiet morning, a faint data packet reappeared on a private academic network. No one knew who sent it. The file contained a simple frequency graph, low amplitude, steady rhythm, repeating every 11 hours and 42 minutes. But embedded within it, in binary code, was something that shouldn't have been there. The pattern wasn't random, it was structured, and when converted into sound, it resembled a heartbeat. That was when the last remaining public stream monitoring 3I Atlas went dark. As the heartbeat pattern repeated across independent data streams, it became impossible to ignore. Not a single observatory had coordinated its schedule, and yet the same signal emerged from Chile, Hawaii, Spain, and the Canary Islands. Identical intervals, identical strength, identical decay. There was no lag, no local interference. The object's pulse was everywhere, and nowhere, all at once. At first, scientists thought it might be a relay echo, perhaps some reflection from Mars's thin ionosphere, but the correlation didn't fit. The pulse seemed to anticipate measurements before they occurred, adjusting in amplitude just moments ahead of scheduled scans. It wasn't reacting to observation anymore, it was predicting it. Within days, the topic spread through encrypted academic channels. Not the mainstream press, not even the major journals, just private circles of researchers where theories could be exchanged without headlines. A physicist at MIT described it as non-linear feedback across the electromagnetic medium, but others didn't buy that explanation. One astrophysicist from Kyoto said it felt more like a learning response, something adapting its emissions in real time to avoid detection. Meanwhile, something subtle began happening to Mars. Satellite data that had remained stable for years started to drift. The magnetometer arrays around the planet's equator showed faint, rhythmic surges, tiny but perfectly timed with 3I Atlas's pulses. It was as if the planet itself was being synchronized. At first, this resonance seemed harmless. The fluctuations were barely measurable, just tremors in data sets. But when an old Mars orbiter, long retired and left in passive observation mode, sent back one final transmission, it contained an image that would unsettle even the most skeptical scientists. The photo was grainy, taken from orbit, half blinded by solar glare. Yet within it, there was an unmistakable shape, a luminous streak running parallel to the horizon, faint but sharply defined, glowing where no atmospheric activity should exist. When they enhanced the image, the streak wasn't random. It followed a curve identical to the object's projected path across Mars's orbit, and at its center was a pinpoint of light, motionless, sustained, and unnaturally steady. The energy signature that accompanied the image was stranger still. Instead of a chaotic burst, it showed a structured waveform, simple, repetitive, and unnervingly clean. It wasn't the kind of signal created by natural processes. It looked encoded. The analysts at ESA and JAXA compared their records from earlier weeks and found something chilling. The pulse that everyone had been measuring, those 11-hour intervals, was now shortening. Not by much, just seconds at a time, but enough to suggest acceleration. The rhythm was quickening and the object's behavior was evolving. One senior analyst in Darmstadt described it bluntly. It's like watching something wake up. Still, no agency spoke publicly. NASA's social channels remained silent. ESA's Mars mission accounts posted nothing for nearly a month. The only updates came through backdoor channels, where amateur astronomers shared coordinates and fragments of raw data that somehow slipped through the blackout. A few of them began noticing a strange effect in their own telescopes, faint distortions at the edge of focus, like atmospheric lensing that shouldn't exist in space. It was as if something invisible surrounded 3I Atlas, refracting light just enough to blur the stars behind it. But then, the strangest part. a small French observatory operating independently, one of the few still releasing public data, caught a brief flash of infrared emission. For 0.7 seconds, the object brightened across all measured wavelengths, producing a perfect sine wave pattern in energy output. Nothing in the known universe behaves that way naturally. For that fraction of a second, it radiated like a transmitter. That single reading reignited debate across the hidden network of scientists still watching. Some claimed it was an automated process, perhaps a natural discharge from charged particles around the comet's field, but others saw it differently. The flash didn't just happen at random, it coincided exactly with the moment a deep space network antenna had turned to its coordinates, almost as though it was replying. For days afterward, the world remained quiet. No agencies commented. The observatory's servers were abruptly taken offline for maintenance. But the few screenshots of that waveform that survived spread quickly, whispered about in encrypted forums and late-night podcasts. Some thought it was coincidence, others didn't. And then, something began to change on Earth itself. A handful of low-frequency radio stations, the kind used for deep-sea communications, started experiencing unexplained interference, not white noise, not static, a repeating pattern buried deep below the audible threshold, cycling in the same rhythm as 3I Atlas's pulse. It was faint, nearly lost in the background hum of the planet, but for those who filtered it carefully, the pattern was there. The realization struck quietly, and it changed everything. If that signal was bleeding through Earth's ionosphere, then whatever was happening near Mars wasn't just local anymore. It was reaching across the void. At that moment, the question stopped being what 3I Atlas was, and became something far more unsettling. What does it want? And somewhere in the deep space archives, long before the blackout, one last encrypted log entry appeared in a forgotten telemetry folder. 3 words. No timestamp, no author. It's observing us. By the time that final log entry began circulating through the back channels, every major observatory in the world was under quiet lockdown. You wouldn't know it from the outside. Their websites still displayed normal operations, archived data still accessible, but those who relied on live feeds could see it clearly. The skies had gone dark. Every major tracking array that had once followed 3I Atlas stopped updating at exactly the same moment. The blackout was too coordinated to be coincidence. Even university-run telescopes began reporting calibration issues. Amateur astronomers found their cloud-linked tracking systems unresponsive. If you aimed your telescope at the coordinates where 3I Atlas should be, you didn't see nothing. You saw distortion, like heat haze in space. At first, this haze was dismissed as optical interference, but one team in Norway decided to run a long-exposure composite, capturing 20 hours of images to average out noise. When they processed the data, something emerged from the background. Not the comet itself, but its shadow, only it wasn't behaving like a shadow should. It was elongated, pulsing at faint intervals, and shifting slightly eastward between frames, even though the object it was supposed to mirror hadn't moved. The light distortion wasn't being cast, it was being projected, almost as though 3I Atlas wasn't reflecting sunlight anymore, but redirecting it. When the team shared the composite privately with colleagues in Finland and Canada, both groups confirmed the same thing. They too saw the moving shadow. The orientation changed depending on the viewer's location, almost like a parallax illusion. But when the angles were mathematically corrected, all the observations pointed toward the same spatial vector, directly toward Earth. That was when the European Space Agency reactivated one of its oldest assets, the Mars Express Orbiter. It hadn't been used for active imaging in years, but its onboard spectrometer could still detect faint radiation patterns. For nearly 48 hours, it tracked the space between Mars and 3I Atlas, analyzing the invisible currents linking the two. The readings were subtle but unmistakable, a continuous stream of low-frequency energy flowing from the comet toward the planet. The implications were enormous. For decades, humanity had treated comets as passive travelers, relics of the early solar system, frozen and harmless. But this was interaction. 3I Atlas wasn't merely passing by Mars, it was doing something to it. When the data reached Earth, only a fraction of it survived the transmission. The rest was corrupted, entire packets overwritten with repeating binary fragments. The recovered fragments, when translated, displayed a curious pattern, numbers that mirrored planetary coordinates, but in reverse. It was as though the signal wasn't being sent to Earth, but from Earth, reflected back with subtle modifications. Some researchers began to suspect that 3i Atlas was listening, actively passing every frequency aimed at it, retransmitting selected echoes back into space as if testing the responses. That would explain the growing interference across communication networks, not random disruption, but targeted sampling. In one of the few internal documents that escaped deletion, an ESA technician wrote, "It's as if the object is trying to understand what's looking at it." As the days passed, more irregularities emerged. Weather satellites began recording faint temperature deviations at high altitudes, not on the scale of global climate, but as thin, vertical channels of warmth slicing through the atmosphere. When aligned against 3i Atlas's trajectory, the anomalies formed a line, a perfectly straight corridor stretching from Mars's orbital plane toward Earth. The scientific explanation for such alignment didn't exist. Gravity doesn't create directional corridors of heat. Magnetic fields don't map themselves across planetary atmospheres with that kind of symmetry, but data from independent observatories confirmed it. The line was real, visible only in infrared, and intensifying every few hours. At the same time, amateur radio operators across Europe and South America started hearing something strange in their shortwave receivers. Not words, not even structured code, but rhythmic oscillations. Each tone lasted precisely 11 seconds. The intervals between tones matched once again the pulse timing of 3i Atlas. And then came the first visual confirmation. A team in Argentina, using a network of high-resolution telescopes to capture near-infrared light, detected faint structures around the comet's periphery, translucent geometric arcs extending outward, almost like overlapping rings. Their orientation changed with each new image, suggesting movement or reconfiguration. No known natural body could produce that symmetry. When the images were enhanced, the arcs appeared to contain motion, not random turbulence, but coordinated shifting, like overlapping layers of thin material, folding and unfolding in precise sequence. The resemblance was uncanny. It looked engineered. Within hours of those images being posted to a private forum, the observatory's data hub was wiped clean. The archived folders vanished, replaced by placeholders that read, "Under review." But the screenshots, already copied by multiple users, survived long enough to confirm what many had begun to suspect. 3i Atlas was not behaving like debris. It was acting like a system. And then, on the third night after the Argentina discovery, one of the telescopes caught something else. A flicker, far in the background. When analysed frame by frame, it became clear that it wasn't a star. It was another object. Smaller, fainter, and trailing behind the comet's projected orbit by several thousand kilometres. It wasn't an isolated reading either. Observatories in Australia and Spain detected the same secondary body just hours later, each confirming its motion in sync with 3i Atlas's path. That meant one thing: whatever 3i Atlas was, it wasn't travelling alone anymore. And if that was true, then everything humanity thought it knew about interstellar visitors was about to be rewritten again. Because one anomaly could be explained away, two could be coincidence. But three moving together under synchronized pulses, that was intent. For a while, astronomers assumed the secondary object was a fragment, a shard ejected during the comet's strange deceleration near Mars. But that theory fell apart almost immediately. Its trajectory wasn't ballistic. It wasn't tumbling or drifting outward the way debris should. It was matching speed perfectly. The two objects moved together, their distances locked as though tethered by invisible gravity. But calculations showed no physical reason they should remain bound. There was no gravitational capture, no shared mass large enough to create such synchronization. The numbers simply didn't add up. That's when radio telescopes began picking up something new. Between the 11-hour pulses that had defined 3i Atlas's pattern, there were now secondary beats, faint, delayed, arriving exactly 1.4 seconds after the main pulse. A harmonic echo. At first, analysts thought it was interference, until they overlaid the pulse timing from both objects and saw what no one wanted to believe. The smaller body was responding. The echoes weren't random. Each secondary pulse slightly adjusted its phase with each repetition, as if calibrating, fine-tuning the interval between them. Within days, the two signals merged into a steady rhythm. Together, they formed what researchers described as a binary cadence. Not just two signals in sync, but two communicating. Even for the most skeptical minds, that realization changed the tone entirely. Suddenly, this wasn't about observing an inert visitor from deep space. It was about witnessing interaction. And that word, interaction, sent ripples through the hidden networks of scientists still watching from the shadows. In France, a small group of astrophysicists began reconstructing the pattern as audio frequencies, translating the radio wave fluctuations into sound. What they heard was haunting, a slow, deliberate sequence of rising and falling tones, layered with faint harmonics. It didn't resemble any known natural radio phenomenon. No pulsar, no plasma oscillation, no background radiation artifact. It sounded designed. And yet, there was something profoundly restrained about it. The signal wasn't loud, it wasn't wideband. It existed on the edge of detectability, as if meant only for those looking closely enough to notice, as if it wanted to be found, but only by those who could understand what it was saying. Around the same time, NASA quietly redirected two retired satellites, one from the old Earth observation series and another decommissioned solar probe, to collect background readings from the general direction of Mars. Though no announcement was made, independent data trackers noticed the shift. The satellite's antennas realigned in unison, both now aimed at a point not listed in any mission log. That point, of course, was 3I Atlas. A week later, the Deep Space Network in Madrid began registering mild fluctuations in background radiation. It was the kind of noise usually ignored as cosmic static, but when filtered, a clear modulation appeared. The same 11-hour pattern, except now stretched. Slowed, almost as if the signal was being redirected, reflected, even, back toward Earth. The implications were staggering. For years, astronomers had spoken of comets as messengers, relics from the birth of the solar system carrying chemical secrets. But now, something about that phrase felt literal. This wasn't a random trajectory, it was a line of communication. And then, something even stranger happened. An independent telescope array in Chile, the same one that had caught the original geometric halo weeks before, recorded a brief but undeniable burst of energy. It wasn't visible light, it was submillimeter radiation, the kind associated with heat transfer in near-vacuum conditions. But the direction was unmistakable. It came from the smaller companion object, not 3I Atlas itself. For 3 minutes, the smaller body flared like a beacon, its output steady and controlled. Then, just as suddenly, it faded. But during those 3 minutes, something changed in 3I Atlas's reflection signature. Its entire visible spectrum shifted slightly toward red, as though it had absorbed energy from the other object. It was the first measurable exchange of power between two non-terrestrial bodies in known history. The reaction across the underground community of scientists was electric. Every encrypted chat, every closed forum, every anonymous publication lit up with theories. Some speculated that the two objects were fragments of the same structure, a main vessel and a smaller probe. Others thought it was an autonomous repair system or an information relay. But the consensus was simple. This was coordination. The question no one could answer was, for what? And as the debate spread, one subtle detail slipped almost unnoticed. Ground-based magnetometers in several countries began registering a faint oscillation in Earth's upper magnetic field. The shift was microscopic, practically invisible against the planet's natural variation, but its rhythm matched the new, slowed pulse coming from space. It was as if the signal wasn't just echoing anymore, it was resonating. Even veteran astronomers who dismissed speculation couldn't explain the timing. Mars's orbit had aligned with Earth's just days earlier, meaning that for a brief window, 3I Atlas, Mars and Earth had formed a nearly perfect straight line through space. If any kind of energy was propagating between them, this was the moment it would reach us. Coincidence? Perhaps. But coincidences don't alter magnetic fields. Within 24 hours, the world's largest radio telescopes, Arecibo's successor in China, the ALMA array in Chile, and the VLA in New Mexico, all reported identical interference patterns. The data was clean, synchronized, and deliberate. The source, when triangulated, came from one exact point, the space between Mars and the orbit of 3I Atlas, not from the comet, not from its companion, from the space between them. Something invisible was now occupying that gap, something transmitting without emitting light, yet powerful enough to disturb Earth's magnetic rhythm. And when the frequencies were run through analysis, the structure of the modulation carried a haunting familiarity. The data wasn't random. It mirrored something humanity had already encountered once before, in 1977. The pattern aligned almost perfectly with the famous wow signal. Only this time it wasn't a random burst. It was repeating. And the realization sank in slowly. Whatever 3i Atlas was doing, it was continuing a conversation that might have begun nearly half a century ago. When the first comparisons between the 3i Atlas signal and the 1977 WOW event appeared online, most people dismissed them as coincidence, wishful thinking by amateurs hunting for patterns where none existed. But inside the astrophysics community, the reaction was different. Too many factors matched. The frequency drift, the harmonic spacing, the signal's duration relative to the background noise. Even the minor oscillations mirrored the same 1420 MHz hydrogen line that defined the original mystery. For over 4 decades, the WOW signal had been the holy grail of unexplained radio phenomena, a single 72-second transmission from deep space that defied every known natural source. And now, 3i Atlas was echoing its fingerprint across multiple observatories. It wasn't just similar, it was evolved. The chatter reached Dr. Avi Loeb at Harvard almost immediately. He'd been one of the few scientists willing to say aloud that interstellar visitors might not all be inert rocks. His earlier research on Oumuamua had sparked controversy for suggesting it could be artificial, perhaps a thin, light-sailing object propelled by radiation pressure. That idea had been dismissed then, but 3i Atlas was harder to ignore. When Loeb's team reconstructed the new waveform using high-precision hydrogen line filtering, they discovered something unprecedented. Embedded between the main peaks of the signal were subharmonics, faint rhythmic modulations that didn't exist in the original WOW burst. To most, they looked like background noise, but after layering them over time, a structure emerged. 3 repeating clusters, each separated by 3.9 minutes, each containing identical internal spacing. In other words, a sequence. Loeb's group didn't publish their findings outright. They leaked them, carefully, through an academic intermediary in Switzerland. Within hours, encrypted research forums lit up with debate. Some claimed the sequence could be natural harmonics caused by plasma diffraction. Others saw something deliberate. An encoded redundancy, perhaps a checksum pattern designed to preserve data integrity across vast distances. And buried in one of Loeb's private memos, later leaked, was a line that captured the unease spreading among those who truly understood what they were seeing. "This is not the same source, it's a reply." The phrase caught like wildfire. What if the WOW signal wasn't a one-off? What if it had been an opening transmission, and 3i Atlas, decades later, was the continuation? While public attention still centered on Mars, governments were already aware that the implications ran far deeper. The sudden magnetic disturbances on Earth, the synchronized pulses between the two spaceborne objects, and now a signal echoing a message from 1977, these were converging threads of something no longer ignorable. The leak triggered the first official reaction in weeks. A NASA spokesperson gave a brief statement, vague but carefully worded. "We are monitoring the 3i Atlas event with international partners. Current data suggests no cause for concern, though further study is ongoing." But behind the rehearsed calm, the agency's internal communications told a different story. 2 teams, one at JPL and another at Goddard, had been instructed to correlate the signal data with the Deep Space Network's archived records from 1977. Those archives weren't publicly available. And when one anonymous technician later revealed that certain legacy tapes were being redigitized under directive, speculation turned into certainty. NASA was comparing the past to the present. And what they found, according to the whispers that escaped the firewall, was disturbing. The 1977 WOW signal wasn't as isolated as history remembered. It had repeated, faintly, intermittently, across several observatories in the months that followed. But those repetitions had been weaker, fading into static. Officially, they were catalogued as noise. Now, with 3i Atlas echoing a stronger, structured variant of the same pattern, the resemblance was undeniable. The timing, frequency, and modulation all fit, as though a decades-old message had found its way home. A quiet debate ignited among astrophysicists. Was this continuation intentional? Was 3i Atlas transmitting on behalf of the original source? Or was it the source itself finally returning to the inner system? Meanwhile, Loeb's private notes revealed something else, something not shared publicly at all. Using triangulation data from multiple receivers, his team had identified a precise directionality in the signal's emission. Not spherical, not diffused like radiation, but focused. The beam wasn't spreading outward into the void, it was narrowing, and that beam was pointed straight toward Earth. At first, this seemed symbolic, like a gesture of attention. But then smaller observatories began detecting increased intensity each time the signal cycled, a subtle amplification suggesting that either the comet was drawing closer or the transmitter within it was refining its aim. That was when the theories shifted from speculative to existential. Some scientists began to wonder if 3i Atlas was not simply transmitting, but scanning, mapping planetary electromagnetic signatures to identify sources of interference, or perhaps intelligence. Others entertained darker possibilities, that it was searching for something specific here, following an old pattern back to its origin. The most unsettling theory came from an astrophysicist at the Max Planck Institute who published anonymously under the pseudonym K. They proposed that the WOW signal in 1977 had been an activation code, a call. 3i Atlas, they suggested, was the response, a delayed reaction spanning light years and decades. In their words, "We called into the dark. Now the dark is calling back." As that line spread through underground channels, the atmosphere in observatories shifted from scientific wonder to restrained alarm. Instruments that once scanned casually for interstellar data were now being recalibrated with precision more suited for defense systems. Even the SETI network quietly reoriented its listening dishes, not outward toward the stars, but inward toward 3i Atlas itself. At this stage, the general public still knew nothing. The headlines spoke only of anomalous comet behavior. But within the scientific world, the truth had already taken root. This wasn't a comet anymore. It was communication, and it was getting closer. And while most institutions struggled to contain the information, one smaller research facility in Alaska did something reckless. They transmitted back. The transmission from Alaska wasn't authorized, wasn't coordinated, and wasn't supposed to happen. It came from a small research group based near Fairbanks, a mix of academic radio astronomers and former communications engineers. Their facility wasn't tied to NASA or the European Space Agency. It was a private observatory funded partly by public grants, partly by independent donors. What they did that night would ripple across the world within hours. They had been monitoring the 3i Atlas signal continuously for 11 days, recording the rhythmic hydrogen line pulses with increasing precision. The group's lead, Dr. Valerie Henning, had grown increasingly convinced that the pattern wasn't just a random sequence, it was a structured modulation that invited replication. If it's testing for feedback, she told her colleagues, then silence means nothing. At 02:13 UTC, they transmitted a simple response, an exact inverted phase of the original signal. The message, if one could call it that, was just a mirror, a reflection. The logic was simple. If the source was actively listening, it would recognize the echo and react. They didn't have to wait long. 7 minutes later, the instruments began to record an anomaly. The incoming pulses shifted, not in frequency, not in volume, but in timing. The once perfect 11-hour rhythm fractured slightly, shortening by a fraction of a second with each new cycle. The Alaska team initially thought it was atmospheric distortion, but as the signal continued to evolve, it became clear 3i Atlas had noticed them. By morning, observatories across the hemisphere confirmed the change. Whatever the comet, or object, was doing, it had adjusted its emissions. The hydrogen line peak had splintered into 3 sub-frequencies, each offset by the exact inverse harmonic of the Alaskan transmission. Statistically, that alignment was impossible by chance. It was a response. But there was something else, something no one expected. Roughly 1 hour after the phase shift, the smaller companion object, the faint trailing body, vanished from visible detection. One frame it was there, the next it was gone. No explosion, no debris, just absence. The thermal signatures, however, told a different story. For nearly 6 hours following the disappearance, orbiting satellites detected a growing field of residual heat spreading outward from the region where the secondary object had been. The pattern didn't resemble combustion or impact. It was smooth, expanding at a constant rate, and centered precisely on the path between Earth and 3I Atlas. The Alaska team went silent after that. They made no public statements, no interviews, but their raw telemetry, quietly mirrored to independent data repositories, told enough of the story. The last entry from their system was time-stamped at 0947 UTC. The note attached to it was brief, written in Henning's own hand. "It's looking back." Within 48 hours, NASA classified all ongoing analysis of the 3I Atlas signal under restricted clearance. The Deep Space Network redirected several of its antennae to what official statements described as routine maintenance. But off-record, multiple engineers confirmed that every major array was now pointed at a single coordinate, the one that intersected the comet's revised trajectory, and that trajectory had changed. For the first time since its discovery, 3I Atlas was no longer following the predictable gravitational path plotted weeks earlier. Its velocity had increased slightly, not dramatically, but enough to confuse orbital models. More concerning was the angle of deviation. Instead of continuing past Mars, it was beginning to shift inward, closer to the ecliptic plane, the path that would bring it within range of Earth's orbital corridor. At this stage, scientists still avoided the word course correction, but deep down, everyone watching the telemetry knew what it looked like. The timing of the shift, coming mere hours after Earth's first confirmed reply, couldn't be ignored. Then came the visual anomaly. A long-exposure composite from the Hubble archive revealed something subtle but chilling. In the faint blur surrounding 3I Atlas's nucleus, the bright, icy core that defined its comet-like appearance, there were streaks, thin, parallel lines radiating outward in perfect symmetry. But when analysts overlaid those lines across multiple exposures, they realized they weren't random jets of gas or dust. They were aligned. Each line pointed toward one of 5 specific points in the inner solar system: Mars, Earth, Venus, Mercury, and the Sun itself. The geometry was too perfect to be coincidental. Loeb's team, now operating from a secure research channel, began running light field simulations. The pattern wasn't just aesthetic. It resembled a network, an array. Each beam could represent a directed path, a kind of triangulated system using planetary bodies as reference nodes. In essence, it looked like 3I Atlas was calibrating the inner system. And then, as if to confirm that suspicion, Earth's magnetometers recorded their strongest deviation yet, a rhythmic oscillation that aligned perfectly with the frequency shifts first triggered by the Alaskan transmission. Loeb's assistant wrote in one report, "We didn't just observe it, we activated it." The theory spread fast through the private channels that maybe, by sending that simple mirror signal, Earth had crossed a threshold it was never meant to. Not an attack, not an invitation, but acknowledgement. The moment the echo reached 3I Atlas, it recognized us. From that moment, everything began to change. In the following days, faint auroras began appearing in regions far from the poles, places that had never seen them before: Chile, Morocco, Greece, southern Japan. But these weren't typical auroras. Their light shimmered with unnatural consistency, pulsing softly in 11-second intervals, the same rhythm. For the first time, the 3I Atlas signature wasn't just something astronomers could detect. It was something the public could see. At first, social media dismissed it as coincidence. Solar activity, magnetic storms, the usual explanations. But when those shimmering bands began aligning geographically along the same vector traced by the comet's energy signature, the illusion of coincidence began to collapse. Somewhere between Mars and Earth, something vast was happening, invisible, silent, and intelligent. By the third night, the auroras had become impossible to ignore. They weren't confined to the upper atmosphere anymore. They were coordinated. Each pulse of light was synchronized across hemispheres, flickering with mechanical precision. Observers from Iceland to South Africa reported identical intervals between flashes, 11 seconds apart, each lasting less than one. It was as if Earth itself was being drawn into resonance with the rhythm of 3I Atlas. Space weather models showed nothing unusual. The sun was quiet, its coronal activity minimal. Yet satellite instruments recorded periodic spikes in upper atmospheric ionization, identical in timing to the new auroral pulse. For the first time, scientists were forced to consider that the lights weren't caused by solar wind at all. They were reactions, atmospheric responses to something else. Avi Loeb's group, now operating under discrete coordination with several European observatories, began analyzing the frequency of these electromagnetic oscillations. Using synchronized ground and orbital readings, they discovered something astonishing. The fluctuations weren't random energy discharges. They carried modulation, encoded variation in amplitude and timing. It wasn't just pulsing, it was communicating. At first, the modulation appeared meaningless, like static filtered through geometry, but as they layered the readings over the earlier 3i Atlas radio sequence, a pattern emerged. The atmospheric pulses weren't new transmissions, they were echoes of the same signal, translated somehow through the Earth's own magnetic field. In other words, the planet was now resonating with the same cadence as the object. The atmosphere had become a medium. Loeb's lab compared this to a crystal radio, a natural transducer using ionized gases instead of circuits. It's as if the Earth itself has joined the conversation, he wrote in his private notes, later leaked through internal sources. Within the global space community, the tone shifted from cautious observation to controlled urgency. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Agencies stopped releasing raw data altogether. The European Space Agency shut down public access to its Mars webcam feed, citing technical maintenance. NASA's telemetry from the Maven orbiter suddenly went dark, and China's Chang'e mission, which had been capturing long-distance imagery of the outer solar system, released one final report before falling silent. The silence became its own signal. Those who had access to internal briefings described a growing consensus. Something around 3i Atlas was generating a field of influence large enough to extend across interplanetary space. The energy wasn't destructive, at least not yet, but it was coordinated, rhythmic, alive with intention. The phrase that began circulating through research channels was field intelligence. Not consciousness in the biological sense, but something structured, responsive, aware of the feedback loop created by Earth's echo. And then, something even more curious occurred. For the first time since the event began, the 3i Atlas emissions slowed. The once steady 11-hour cycle stretched to 12, then 13. The smaller fluctuations smoothed into long, slow oscillations, almost like deep breathing. It was as if the object, or whatever operated through it, was waiting. This deceleration came with an unexpected companion effect, a global quieting of the auroras. They didn't vanish, but their pulsing softened, fading into slow waves of light barely visible against the night sky. Those who had been tracking them for days described the sensation as eerie, like the moment before a storm when everything falls still. At this point, Loeb's team decided to attempt something bold. If the field was reacting to human signals, then perhaps it could be studied in reverse. They developed a low-frequency broadcast using Earth's own magnetic flux as the carrier. Instead of transmitting into space, they modulated the magnetosphere itself, a silent ripple intended to test whether 3i Atlas would respond again. The sequence they chose was mathematical, a pattern derived from the Fibonacci series, chosen because it appears everywhere in nature. To human science, it was an elegant proof of origin, something intelligent but non-threatening. 2 hours after transmission, instruments began to register an unexpected reply. The hydrogen line emission from 3i Atlas flared sharply, then stabilized into a new cadence, 3 rapid bursts followed by one elongated wave, repeating every minute. It wasn't the same pattern as before, it was something new. When converted into sound, the sequence resembled a rising tone followed by a deep harmonic drop, unsettlingly organic, almost like a breath. And buried beneath it, within the noise floor, analysts found the faintest structure of repeated ratios that matched exactly the same Fibonacci spacing Earth had just sent. The conclusion was inescapable. It understood. At this stage, NASA's Public Relations Office issued a rare statement to deflect attention. They described the ongoing phenomena as solar interaction anomalies and urged the public not to misinterpret unrelated data correlations. It was the language of containment, carefully chosen to sound rational while concealing the scale of what was actually unfolding. But by then, secrecy was impossible. Amateur astronomers across multiple continents were recording the same emissions using consumer-grade radio telescopes. The data was undeniable. Whatever 3i Atlas had become, it was responding to Earth directly. Inside the community, fear began to surface quietly, disguised as scientific restraint. If the object could interpret structured data, then what else could it do? Was it learning, adapting, anticipating? A new hypothesis emerged among Loeb's circle, one that none of them wanted to publish. It suggested that 3i Atlas might not be sending information in the traditional sense, but using resonance itself as a form of sensing. By inducing electromagnetic harmony with planets, it could map internal structures, magnetic flows, even the presence of artificial fields. If true, it meant that by echoing its signal, Earth had opened itself entirely. Every network, every electrical grid, every radio wave, all now vibrating faintly, in sync with the same frequency that filled the space between Mars and Earth. Loeb wrote one final memo that week, a line that captured the unease spreading through the quiet corridors of global science. It's not looking for a reply, it's looking for reflection. And as those words reached the inboxes of agencies now under blackout, a new kind of pulse began sweeping across the magnetosphere, faster, sharper, almost impatient. The conversation, whatever it was, had shifted tone. For weeks, 3i Atlas had been little more than a distant point of light, a glowing wanderer against the black silence of space. But in late September, high-resolution imagery from multiple observatories began to show something unsettling. The shape of the object was no longer consistent. Initially, the changes were subtle, a slight distortion along the nucleus, a faint asymmetry in the tail. But by the third night, the difference was unmistakable. 3i Atlas was no longer rotating in a way that could be described by natural physics. Instead, its form appeared to shift, almost like a mirage caught between two overlapping realities. At certain wavelengths, it remained the familiar icy blue haze of a comet. At others, it refracted light in ways that suggested metallic or crystalline surfaces. The two visual identities seemed to exist simultaneously, phasing in and out of each other with perfect rhythmic timing. The pattern, Loeb's team noticed, corresponded exactly to the same Fibonacci signal they had sent days earlier. It was responding again, but this time, not through radio or magnetism. It was responding visually. Infrared readings from Mars orbit confirmed that whatever was happening wasn't atmospheric distortion or imaging error. The temperature profile of the object itself was oscillating in precise synchronization with its changing luminosity. That meant energy was being redistributed across its structure, intentionally. "It's acting like an adaptive lens," Loeb said in a private briefing to a European consortium. "It's using its own body as a signaling instrument." But there was something far more shocking in the data. The light variations weren't random, they were coherent. When mapped spectrally and converted into a 3D model, the peaks formed an unmistakable structure, a grid, rotating slowly within the light itself, as if projected from within the object. The grid expanded, then contracted, aligning perfectly with the rhythm of the earlier magnetic pulses recorded on Earth. In effect, 3i Atlas was creating a holographic pattern visible only to instruments tuned to its wavelength. It was showing something. The question was, to whom? NASA's official channels, still publicly silent, began distributing internal notices marked under Level 4 Communication Event. These weren't routine data updates. They were coordination requests, instructions to cross-compare readings from Mars orbiters, lunar satellites, and deep space antennas. Each message carried a single repeated directive: correlate light field anomalies, prioritize pattern continuity. Within a day, data analysts inside the agency began to whisper about what they were seeing. The pattern wasn't random geometry, it was consistent, repeated, structured. When assembled across time, the oscillating grid revealed what appeared to be a three-dimensional matrix, 12 intersecting planes connected by radiating arcs. It looked eerily like a topological map, except it wasn't mapping space, it was mapping fields. The arcs corresponded to planetary magnetic zones: Mars, Earth, Venus, and Mercury, all connected by the grid's lattice. And at the center, glowing faintly in the spectral reconstruction, was the Sun. It was as if the object was drawing the magnetic skeleton of the inner solar system. When Loeb's assistant ran a Fourier analysis of the signal's harmonic signature, the results deepened the mystery. The base frequency, the one aligning with Earth's auroral pulses, matched the orbital resonance ratio between Earth and Mars to 6 decimal places. 3i Atlas wasn't just near Mars, it was using Mars. Around this time, astronomers began noticing something new in the images. Small flashes near the object, not jets, not debris, but localized bursts of light that appeared in triangular formations. They would flare, hold for 3 seconds, then fade. When overlaid sequentially, the flares traced geometric constellations, repeating configurations that always formed near the same coordinates relative to the object's surface. The community nicknamed them symmetry events. To most, they looked like reflections or lensing artifacts. But Loeb disagreed. In one of his encrypted research logs, he wrote, "Symmetry is never random. Nature's chaos doesn't draw perfect triangles." By then, the media had caught wind of the story. Headlines spread across independent outlets. NASA data leak suggests Comet may be artificial, but official spokespeople deflected, claiming the images were misinterpreted composites. Still, more evidence arrived every night. The object's brightness continued to rise, not exponentially, but methodically, following a curve so precise it resembled a plotted graph. If this was natural, it was performing mathematics. And yet, amid all this, something even stranger happened. The auroras that had dimmed days earlier began to return, but this time their colors shifted, from green to deep violet. Atmospheric physicists couldn't explain it. Violet auroras required energy far beyond what Earth's upper atmosphere could generate naturally. The intensity of the pulses matched the same intervals as the symmetry events observed near 3i Atlas. Earth and the object were now in lockstep. When Loeb compared the oscillations between the two phenomena, the auroras and the geometric light bursts, he found that they were phase-matched, down to fractions of a millisecond. The implication was staggering. The same timing mechanism was driving both. It was no longer just a visual coincidence, it was synchronization. At this point, even the skeptics began to falter. A growing number of scientists quietly admitted what others feared to say out loud. 3. Atlas wasn't behaving as if it had entered the solar system. It was behaving as if it had activated something within it. And what it was awakening, no one could define. By early October, the symmetry events were no longer isolated. They had multiplied, forming intricate lattices of light around 3i Atlas's halo, pulsing in measured harmony. Every burst carried the same cadence Earth's auroras had adopted days earlier. The object's visual field now resembled a living diagram, geometry painted across the void. The phenomenon was first captured clearly by the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. Its long-range imaging sensors recorded 12 synchronized bursts arranged in perfect alignment, an array of equilateral triangles arranged around the object's axis. The configuration wasn't random. It was symmetrical to Mars's magnetic poles. When mapped against the planet's magnetosphere, the light events corresponded precisely to regions of field tension, zones where Mars's weak magnetic remnants still lingered. It was as though the object were probing the planet's magnetic scars, mapping them through resonance. Loeb's assistant, analyzing the readings, wrote quietly in the lab notes, "It's building a model, field geometry, not matter. It's not observing planets. It's scanning the grid." But the data coming from Mars suggested something even more profound. The planet's ambient magnetic signature, usually stable and weak, had begun to oscillate. Instruments onboard orbiters detected sudden spikes of electromagnetic flux radiating outward from the surface in rhythm with 3i Atlas's light pulses. The effect was small, but measurable. For a world that had long since lost its magnetic shield, this was unprecedented. At first, scientists suspected the readings were artifacts, cross-interference from the object's emission field, but repeated verification by separate orbiters ruled that out. The field was real. Mars, the long-dead planet, was responding. Loeb described it in one closed briefing as planetary resonance. In his view, 3i Atlas was not simply observing, it was stimulating. He likened it to sonar, sending waves through magnetic space, then measuring the returning echoes to reconstruct a three-dimensional field map. But what it was building from those echoes, no one could say. Inside NASA's Deep Space Analysis Division, simulations began to reveal a terrifying possibility. If 3i Atlas was establishing magnetic resonance with planetary fields, then the next logical target wasn't Mars. It was Earth, and indeed, that seemed to be exactly what was happening. Magnetometers across the globe, both government and independent, started detecting faint rhythmic oscillations superimposed on the planet's natural Schumann resonance. The pattern was precise, 11 cycles per second, fluctuating in harmony with the object's most recent emission pulse. At first, the effect was barely perceptible, buried within the noise of natural magnetic background, but within days, the amplitude doubled. By the end of the week, the signal could be seen clearly on all monitoring instruments, its peaks rising above baseline levels. Earth was singing back. Loeb's team was among the first to recognize the danger. If the object was inducing resonance intentionally, even minimal alignment could theoretically alter magnetospheric behavior, potentially destabilizing satellite orbits or distorting atmospheric charge distributions. The result wouldn't be immediate destruction, but a gradual shift in the electromagnetic balance that shields Earth from solar radiation. And if that shield wavered, even briefly, the consequences would cascade. Still, Loeb refused to frame it as an attack. In his private notes, he called it mutual adaptation, suggesting that whatever intelligence governed 3I Atlas was testing compatibility, not dominance. "It's adjusting to our frequency," he wrote, or worse, it's asking us to adjust to its. In the days that followed, a strange phenomenon began to unfold in Mars's orbit. The thin atmosphere, long considered inert, started producing localized flashes of light, tiny glows visible even from Earth-based telescopes. They appeared along the planet's equator, each lasting only a few seconds before vanishing again. When analyzed spectrally, the emissions matched the same ionization lines as those seen in Earth's auroras. But there was no solar wind to drive them. The energy was coming from somewhere else. That somewhere was 3I Atlas. Its pulses had intensified, subtle but undeniable. The light from its nucleus grew sharper, more defined, the halo thinning as if its energy were being concentrated. For the first time, observers could make out distinct shapes within its luminous shell. Rings, arcs, and, at times, structures resembling vast, transparent blades curving outward from its core. The geometry was mathematically perfect, following ratios that repeated throughout natural systems, 1.618 to 1, the golden ratio. It wasn't random, it was engineered. The implication was chilling. Whatever 3I Atlas was, it understood proportion, symmetry, and harmony at a scale that spanned worlds. Satellite telemetry from the Mars orbiters soon revealed an even more alarming truth. The object wasn't just reacting to magnetism, it was manipulating trajectory. Its velocity vector had shifted again, this time aligning directly with the orbital resonance between Mars and Earth. The shift was subtle but deliberate. It was adjusting its path, synchronizing to a gravitational ratio, a ratio that had meaning only if it intended to. Inside the Global Research Network, an encrypted message began circulating quietly. Its author, unidentified, summarized what most now feared to acknowledge. "It's using orbital mechanics as communication. We are part of its design." In Loeb's next transmission to his inner circle, he admitted what even he had resisted saying for weeks. "The more we observe it, the more it reflects us. It doesn't behave like a visitor. It behaves like a mirror, but a mirror that remembers what it reflects." For some that was poetry, for others prophecy. But for the few who understood the physics beneath the metaphor, it was terror in disguise. Because if 3I Atlas was indeed using the solar system as a lattice, a medium through which to transmit or sustain something, then the activation had already begun. The inner planets, tied together through electromagnetic resonance, might no longer be independent entities. They could be functioning now as nodes within a greater mechanism, something ancient, mathematical, and far beyond comprehension. And still, the pulses continued, every 11 seconds, each one slightly stronger than the last. In the dark observatories of Hawaii, Chile, and the Canary Islands, astronomers stared at the data in silence, aware that they were witnessing the kind of event that history would one day define as a threshold, the point where observation ends and participation begins. Within a week of the resonance event, something subtle began to occur on Earth. At first, it went unnoticed. Small variations in compass readings, brief fluctuations in the magnetic north position, sensors drifting slightly off calibration, but to those who were watching, it was unmistakable. Earth's magnetic field was no longer stable. Magnetometers across continents began logging an oscillation that no model could predict. Every 11 seconds, the same interval now embedded in 3I Atlas's pulse, the field strength dipped, then returned. It wasn't destructive, but it was precise, mechanical, deliberate. Satellites in low orbit detected minute disturbances in ionospheric density, like the faint heartbeat of an invisible machine buried inside the sky. Power grids in high latitudes started reporting odd surges, enough to trip automated systems, but too minor to trigger public alarms. Communications engineers called it ghost interference. To anyone unaware of 3I Atlas, it was just another cosmic anomaly. But within research circles, the implications were extraordinary and quietly terrifying. For the first time in recorded history, the Earth's magnetosphere was resonating in step with an external body. The realization reached Loeb's lab late one night. His assistant compared satellite telemetry to atmospheric data from the European Space Weather Service. The alignment was perfect. Every rise and fall in magnetic flux on Earth matched the object's pulses within milliseconds. The planet wasn't just being influenced, it was being tuned. Loeb stared at the screen in silence. "It's calibrating," he finally said. "Like it's testing limits, amplitude, tolerance, resistance." "Testing for what?" his colleague asked. Loeb didn't answer. Meanwhile, Mars, the original focal point of 3I Atlas's arrival, had entered an equally strange phase. The planet's previously unstable magnetic remnants had begun to stabilize. Sensors on board the Maven orbiter recorded a measurable, organized field stretching across the equatorial regions. It wasn't strong enough to shield the planet like Earth's magnetosphere, but it was coherent, something Mars hadn't possessed for billions of years. To planetary scientists, the readings bordered on impossible. The Martian core was long presumed dormant. Without active convection, there could be no dynamo effect, no global field. Yet the data showed otherwise. Magnetic lines reforming, wrapping the planet like faint tendrils of light. When overlaid with the timing of 3I Atlas's emissions, the correlation was exact. The object's pulses weren't just affecting fields, they were structuring them. NASA's internal simulations struggled to model what was happening. Some theorists proposed plasma coupling between planetary orbits. Others suggested an induced resonance cascade. But Loeb's private analysis went further. He proposed that 3I Atlas was not causing random disturbances, but repairing a pattern, restoring a balance across the solar system's electromagnetic lattice. He wrote in his notes, "What if this mechanism was always here? What if the solar system has a harmonic architecture, a hidden order that occasionally requires tuning?" It was a theory as elegant as it was terrifying, because if 3I Atlas was indeed a repair mechanism, then its purpose wasn't observation but correction, and correction, by definition, implies something is broken. While scientific debate simmered, the physical effects on Earth deepened. Pilots reported unusual auroral curtains extending farther south than ever recorded. They weren't the familiar green or violet bands. These glowed pale gold, rippling like fabric underwater. Radar systems briefly lost coherence when the lights intensified, suggesting dense ionization at altitudes where auroras should not exist. The world's magnetic north began to drift faster. Centimeters turned to meters in a single week. In some regions, GPS accuracy degraded so severely that flight navigation systems required manual overrides. Yet despite the disruptions, the pattern remained stable. There was no chaos, only rhythm. "It's like the planet's heartbeat is sinking," one NOAA analyst said during a private call. "If it wanted to destroy us, it already could have. This feels like recalibration." At the same time, Mars's transformation accelerated. Orbital imagery revealed a diffuse aurora stretching across its entire night side, a shimmering ring of electric blue. For the first time in human history, Mars glowed like Earth. The faint field lines connected directly to 3I Atlas's coordinates, as if a current now flowed between world and visitor. Space agencies avoided public comment, but one leak from the European network exposed a classified term now used internally: planetary harmonic synchronization event. To most, it sounded poetic. To those who understood electromagnetism, it sounded like design. Loeb convened his core researchers one final time before data sharing was shut down worldwide. He stood at the center of the dim lab, screens flickering with synchronized readings from both planets. "You see the pattern," he said softly. Earth, Mars, the object. 3 frequencies, 1 resonance. That's a chord. In music, a chord builds harmony. In physics, it builds structure. He paused. And if it's rebuilding structure, then maybe it's fixing the imbalance that made Mars die. Silence filled the room. None of them dared to ask the next question aloud, whether fixing meant salvation or transformation. Because what happens to a planet when it's retuned by something that thinks in wavelengths instead of biology? As night fell across Earth, more people began to notice subtle shifts, not catastrophic but uncanny, birds migrating off course, ocean currents drifting slightly north, the auroras reflecting faintly off sea surfaces in latitudes that had never seen them before. Even the tides seemed fractionally out of rhythm, as though the moon's influence was being nudged by another invisible hand. And all the while, 3I Atlas hovered near Mars, glowing faintly, its geometry now unmistakable, no longer a comet, not an asteroid, but a deliberate structure of light and form, breathing in slow cycles, waiting for something unseen to respond. The waiting became the new terror, because every 11 seconds, the Earth itself pulsed in time with it. By the second week of synchronization, the magnetic patterns no longer appeared random. Data from multiple observatories began revealing faint substructures embedded within the oscillations, a hidden rhythm buried inside the main signal. When plotted across time, it formed repeating clusters that mirrored not chaos, but intention. Loeb's team, using a Fourier transform model, stripped away background frequencies to isolate the bass harmonic. What emerged silenced the entire room. The oscillations matched the orbital resonance ratios of the inner planets, Mercury's quick, tight cycle, Venus's slower rotation, Earth's steady pulse, and Mars's faint, newly awakened rhythm. It was a map, not of space, but of movement, a portrait of the solar system written in magnetic language. Someone whispered, "It's not just aligning the planets, it's remembering them." Across independent research networks, similar findings surfaced. A team in Geneva discovered that when the pulses were plotted 3-dimensionally, they produced a pattern almost identical to an ancient heliocentric diagram sketched by early astronomers, the one Da Vinci had called the harmonic machine of God. The implication was absurd, impossible, yet mathematically perfect. 3I Atlas was recreating the architecture of the solar system in frequency form, as though reprogramming the magnetic memory of each world. The media, still blacked out of official data streams, could only speculate. Most dismissed it as a network glitch or overinterpretation. But inside NASA's private research servers, something far more serious was happening. Instruments aboard deep space probes, Voyager, New Horizons, and even the recently reactivated Parker Array all reported simultaneous disruptions. Each probe experienced a momentary blackout lasting exactly 11.1 seconds, the same number that had haunted every measurement since the object's arrival. When communications resumed, every probe's trajectory telemetry showed the same anomaly, an infinitesimal shift in their inertial reference frames, as though space itself had vibrated. The cosmic background hadn't changed, yet every instrument recorded the same deviation, like ripples spreading through a pond after a silent impact. To most engineers, the event looked like a mild sensor calibration drift, but Loeb recognized the signature instantly. It matched the modulation pattern from 3I Atlas. The blackout wasn't a failure, it was a handshake. At this point, the object's behavior shifted again. Its outer halo, once faint and diffuse, began to condense into layered arcs. High-resolution imagery showed what looked like concentric shells forming around the nucleus. Not gas, but light itself, refracted in consistent intervals like nested rings. Each layer reflected different wavelengths, almost like a prism turning itself inside out. The phenomenon baffled optical physicists. No natural process could maintain coherent light rings across that distance without scattering. It required control, feedback, adjustment, self-correction. It required awareness. When the European team attempted to triangulate the structure's exact size, they found something impossible. Its apparent diameter wasn't fixed. It expanded and contracted in rhythm with the magnetic pulses, almost breathing, almost alive. A comet that inhaled the light of a star and exhaled geometry, and as the pulses intensified, the planets began to respond. Venus's upper atmosphere registered unexpected changes. localized ionization patterns along its terminator line. Mercury's magnetotail, normally weak, strengthened slightly. Even Earth's magnetic poles drifted closer to alignment with Mars's newly stabilized field. The solar system, once a collection of independent bodies, was becoming synchronized, a network of planets moving to the same unseen rhythm. Loeb tried to explain it to his colleagues in the simplest possible terms. We think of space as empty, but it's not. It's a medium, like the surface of a drum. If you strike it in the right places, everything vibrates in tune, and something out there just found the pattern. The statement was meant for scientists, but within hours it leaked, spreading across private forums. Some saw it as awe-inspiring, others as catastrophic. Religious groups interpreted it as cosmic awakening. Skeptics called it hysteria, yet the evidence was there, real, measurable, undeniable. That night, Loeb's team noticed something else. The pattern of pulses had changed subtly, not faster, but more complex. It now contained intervals where the signal briefly inverted polarity, flipping between positive and negative charge in microseconds. When visualized, the inversion produced sharp breaks, short, encoded bursts resembling binary code. Data scientists from MIT reconstructed the sequence. When converted to visual form, the binary manifested as a spiral, 12 loops radiating from a central node. It was not random. Each loop corresponded to the orbital position of one planet or known object in the inner solar system, but one loop had no match, positioned just beyond Mars's orbit, an empty space waiting for something that didn't yet exist. Loeb stared at it for a long time before speaking. It's designing something, a missing node, or maybe it's waiting for us to complete it. Before anyone could respond, an alert flashed across the observatory network. Every Mars orbiter had just gone offline, simultaneously. For 12 full minutes, no signal returned. Ground control scrambled, fearing a catastrophic systems error. Yet when communications resumed, all orbiters were functioning perfectly. Telemetry showed no malfunction, but their clock syncs had shifted forward, exactly 11.1 seconds. The timing was identical to the deep space blackout days earlier. This was no coincidence. The solar system was now operating in intervals, like gears aligning in a machine long dormant. By dawn, independent astronomers confirmed what no one had wanted to admit. The background resonance, the 11-second pulse, was no longer faint. It had become audible in radio frequencies, blending with natural static. Tuned precisely to 1.98 MHz, the signal produced a haunting, rhythmic tone, deep, steady, almost musical, a cosmic metronome keeping time across worlds. When the waveform was slowed down 1,000-fold, Loeb recognized the pattern. It wasn't just a pulse, it was modulation, amplitude-coded variation, carrying information, a signal, intentional, directed. He recorded one entry before sending his team home that morning. It's no longer a question of what it is, the question is what it remembers. By the third week, 3I Atlas's pulses were no longer merely data points. They had become a living rhythm threaded through every measurement, every transmission, every field. To most of the world it was invisible, but to those monitoring the skies it was like watching the heartbeat of something vast and ancient awaken. Loeb, sleep-deprived but relentless, spent his nights decoding the modulated signal. When his team slowed the waveform even further, the structure inside became undeniable. Sequences repeating in mathematical ratios matching orbital periods from human antiquity. Data too precise for coincidence. One ratio in particular caught his attention, 1.1.618, the same golden ratio that governed the geometry of shells, galaxies, and even 3I Atlas's layered halo. But here, it was more specific. It mapped the distance between Earth and Mars when plotted against their respective magnetic amplitudes, as if the object had not only measured both planets, but understood their proportional resonance. In one corner of his monitor, Loeb overlaid the signal against reconstructed orbital charts from Mesopotamian astronomy. Clay tablets etched 5,000 years ago by early skywatchers who mapped planetary cycles by hand. The match was perfect. The signal wasn't random, it was historical. It mirrored data once known to humanity and then lost. When he realized that, Loeb froze. "It's not communicating forward," he whispered. "It's echoing backward." The next morning, his hypothesis was tested in the most unexpected way. Across the northern hemisphere, radio operators began reporting bursts of interference, not the usual static from solar storms, but structured distortions that seemed to carry rhythm. Amateur astronomers listening to shortwave channels captured the sound, a low, resonant hum cycling every 11 seconds, interlaced with faint tones. Some described it as mechanical, others said it sounded almost vocal. It spread quickly through civilian networks. People began recording and uploading the hum, unaware that they were hearing the same modulation Loeb's team had been studying in silence for weeks. For the first time, the synchronization wasn't confined to machines. It had entered the audible world. In the days that followed, the visual changes began. Auroras appeared in skies far beyond their natural range, over deserts, coastlines, even cities bathed in constant artificial light. But they weren't green or violet. They shimmered in bands of silver and gold, reflecting like liquid metal. Photographers who captured long exposures noticed something stranger still. The auroras weren't random curtains of light. They were patterns, geometric, recursive, almost architectural. Each arc mirrored the shape of 3I Atlas's outer halo. It was as if the object's structure were being projected across the magnetosphere, writing itself onto Earth's skies. At the same time, seismic monitors began picking up faint rhythmic vibrations, so weak they couldn't cause tremors, yet perfectly timed to the 11-second pulse. The planet itself was resonating. In Alaska, a network of underground sensors used to monitor nuclear activity recorded the same frequency deep within the crust. It wasn't just in the air, it was inside the Earth. Loeb's analysis became more urgent. His team discovered that when the magnetic oscillations were visualized in 3D, they formed a shape eerily similar to a torus, a looping field geometry identical to the one found in plasma containment research and theoretical warp models. If 3I Atlas was generating that structure across multiple planets, then it wasn't just transmitting information, it was altering the energy topology of the solar system itself. The idea was beyond comprehension, yet the math held, every data point aligned. The object's actions were consistent with large-scale field harmonization, an attempt to restore a form of equilibrium that human physics had only begun to imagine. Loeb spoke quietly during one of his final internal briefings. It's not just sending a signal, it's using the planets as resonant amplifiers. The solar system is becoming an instrument, and we are part of its sound. The statement leaked within hours. Online discussions erupted, split between fascination and fear. Some saw it as a form of cosmic awakening, others warned it was terraforming at an electromagnetic scale. But amid the noise, one question dominated. What happens when the music reaches its crescendo? Then came the blackout. At precisely 03:11 UTC, deep space monitoring arrays in Canberra, Madrid, and Goldstone simultaneously lost contact with every probe beyond Mars. Not just a signal drop, total silence. Voyager 1, Voyager 2, and even New Horizons vanished from telemetry. For 15 minutes, the universe went still. Then, just as suddenly, they came back. All systems nominal, all instruments functioning, but with one impossible addition. Each probe transmitted a single unrequested data packet tagged automatically by onboard systems. Inside the binary payload, engineers found a short repeating phrase encoded in ASCII, sequence complete. No one could explain it. The phrase hadn't originated from Earth's uplink, and there was no evidence of external tampering. The words appeared spontaneously within multiple autonomous systems separated by billions of kilometers. When the message reached Loeb's lab, he stared at it for a long time, the weight of understanding settling across his face. The synchronization was the setup, he said finally. This is the response. That night, for the first time since the event began, something visible changed in the sky. Just after midnight, telescopes across Europe and South America captured faint concentric ripples spreading outward from Mars's orbit. They weren't light nor matter, but distortions in space itself, bending starlight as they passed. The ripples travelled slowly, elegantly, in perfect symmetry, expanding across the solar plane like the surface of a pond after a single drop. Observers described them as waves of glass, shimmering and silent, rippling through constellations. And as the third ripple crossed Earth's orbit, every magnetometer on the planet recorded a single, synchronized pulse. Then, silence. The hum vanished. The skies cleared. For a moment, the world seemed to exhale, but Loeb knew better. The silence wasn't an ending, it was an intake of breath. Because every time the cosmos resets its rhythm, it does so before something begins. The silence that followed the third ripple was unlike anything Earth had ever experienced. For 48 hours, the planet's magnetic field held perfectly steady, not a single fluctuation. It was as though the world itself had been switched into standby mode. Seismographs flattened, atmospheric noise vanished. Even the faint radio hiss that had long formed the background hum of space went eerily still. The world didn't notice at first. News cycles moved on. Governments declared the anomalies over. Yet in laboratories and observatories, the scientists who had watched from the beginning could sense it. The silence wasn't absence. It was containment. Loeb stayed awake through both nights, staring at data feeds that refused to move. "It's holding us," he said quietly. "It's waiting for equilibrium." But then, at 03:11 UTC, the same timestamp that had marked every major event, the data stirred again. Not violently, not chaotically, but with elegance. Earth's magnetic field began to oscillate, not in the 11-second pulse they had grown used to, but in a new rhythm, slower, deeper, almost like breathing. In oceanic monitoring stations, currents began shifting direction. The Atlantic's great conveyor slowed by a measurable fraction. The Pacific's jet stream thickened. Atmospheric moisture patterns drifted north, redistributing clouds in arcs that mirrored the electromagnetic flow. The changes weren't destructive, they were graceful, ordered. At the same time, Mars's orbit brightened. Its surface, normally matte and lifeless, began reflecting sunlight with unusual intensity. High-altitude dust storms dissipated, leaving the atmosphere translucent. For the first time since humanity had begun observing it, the red planet seemed alive. Orbital cameras recorded flashes near its polar regions. Not lightning, not solar reflection, but ionized streaks curving upward, as though energy were bleeding from the ground into the sky. 3I Atlas hovered nearby, motionless yet radiant, its geometry sharper now, its halo divided into 3 distinct layers. It was no longer behaving like an object, it was functioning like a device. Loeb's team tried to model what was happening, but the math refused to hold. The system wasn't chaotic, but it wasn't linear either. Each input changed the very rules of calculation. "It's recursive," one of his analysts muttered. "It's rewriting constants as it runs." In layman's terms, the laws of physics weren't breaking, they were adapting. One satellite above the equator captured something even stranger. As the magnetic field flexed, faint filaments of plasma began tracing lines between Earth and the Moon, invisible most of the time, but suddenly illuminated during certain solar angles. The lines weren't natural auroras, they were connections, precise and symmetrical, mapping out geometric paths between gravitational bodies. Loeb recognized the pattern instantly. "It's a field circuit," he said, "the same design in the pulses. It's connecting everything, Earth, Mars, the Moon, through resonance." The concept defied existing science. No known force could synchronize fields across such distances without massive energy loss. Yet 3I Atlas was doing it effortlessly, like a conductor aligning every planet into the same invisible score. To confirm, Loeb cross-referenced ancient orbital records. The resonances matched alignments last seen during rare conjunctions tens of thousands of years ago, eras often associated with unexplained surges in atmospheric ionization and rapid shifts in climate stability. "It's happened before," he said softly, "but back then we didn't have the instruments to see it." The next morning, unexpected reports began arriving from across the world. In Norway, auroras reappeared, but this time they didn't flicker. They hung motionless, shimmering in golden spirals above the horizon, forming perfect circles that slowly rotated as though marking time. In Chile, astronomers observed Mars's glow intensify to the point where it cast measurable shadows on the desert floor, impossible under normal brightness levels. In Australia, marine biologists found coral polyps reacting to magnetic fluctuations, opening and closing in rhythm with the pulses. And in Japan, the superconducting gravimeters used to measure Earth's mass anomalies recorded a fractional but undeniable change. The planet's moment of inertia, its internal spin constant, had shifted by a measurable degree. The Earth had adjusted itself to what no one yet knew. Loeb convened his remaining team one last time. The rest of the world's agencies had gone silent again, data access restricted, communications rerouted. Yet within his small, dim lab, the feeds continued to run, displaying numbers that no longer made sense. He pointed to a graph showing Mars's magnetic field strength. It's stabilizing faster than any dynamo model predicts. That means the field isn't natural, it's induced. Something's feeding it energy from outside. One of his researchers frowned. From 3I Atlas, Loeb nodded. But not just Mars. Look at Earth's correlation lag. It's closing. We're sinking. The frequency separation between the two planets is narrowing with every cycle. Like a resonance lock. Exactly, he said. When two oscillating systems fall into harmonic lock, energy transfer becomes perfect. Zero loss. It's like the difference between random waves and a chord. He paused. But that means, when the alignment completes, both systems will act as one. The realization hung in the air like a slow-turning shadow. If Mars and Earth are now resonant, his colleague whispered, what happens next? Loeb leaned back, exhaustion visible in his eyes. Then 3I Atlas doesn't need to transmit anymore. It will activate whatever this pattern is meant to do. As dusk fell, telescopes worldwide turned toward Mars again. The planet's glow had intensified to a degree unseen in recorded history. Its polar caps shimmered with faint light, not reflection, but emission. In spectral analysis, the glow carried traces of oxygen excitation, the same wavelength Earth's auroras produced. To scientists, it was impossible. To Loeb, it was confirmation. Mars wasn't being terraformed, it was being awakened. In the last recorded data burst before NASA's servers went dark, 3I Atlas emitted one final sequence, 3 pulses, evenly spaced, each lasting precisely 11.1 seconds. When converted into sound frequencies, the pulses formed a tritone, a chord composed of 3 resonant frequencies corresponding to Earth, Mars, and the Sun. It wasn't random, it was orchestration. Loeb wrote one final note in his journal before the network cut out. It was never about impact or destruction. It's about connection. The system isn't being observed, it's being restarted. And somewhere between Earth and Mars, in the space where silence used to live, something enormous began to move. At first, the movement was subtle, a gentle realignment rather than a shock. 3I Atlas, once a drifting silhouette near Mars's orbit, now began to glide against the solar wind in defiance of every physical model. It did not accelerate or decelerate. It adjusted, as though space itself were accommodating it. For days, the object traced a slow curve around the red planet, leaving behind a faint trail of luminescent particles that refused to disperse. The trail's shape resembled the path of an orbit, except it wasn't Mars's. It mirrored Earth's trajectory, projected outward like a reflection caught in motion. Loeb's exhausted team cross-referenced the geometry. The line was perfect, an analogue of Earth's elliptical path, positioned precisely in Mars's orbital plane. To anyone else, it was a coincidence. To Loeb, it was a blueprint. He called it the planetary circuit. His notes described it in stark terms. If 3I Atlas is reconstructing orbital geometry in the form of energy paths, then the solar system is being mapped not as mass, but as resonance. The orbits are frequencies, the bodies are amplifiers. This wasn't new territory to theoretical astrophysics, but no one had ever seen it happen in real time. That evening, data from the magnetospheric probes surrounding Earth began to oscillate again. The pulse had returned, but softer this time, slower, as if stabilizing rather than disrupting. Each oscillation corresponded precisely with the movement of 3I Atlas, and then the light returned. Across Europe and the Western Pacific, night skies shimmered with faint metallic bands. But this time, the color was different, not gold or silver, but pale blue, threaded with white streaks that bent and curved in intricate arcs. The auroras no longer drifted randomly, they organized. Satellite footage showed them aligning into enormous hexagonal formations above both poles, hexagons that mirrored similar structures once seen on Saturn's atmosphere. The symmetry was impossible to ignore. Something is forming, Loeb said quietly. It's geometric, intentional, and synchronized with Mars's magnetic output. A hush filled the lab. Every monitor was showing the same pattern. Even in regions of complete daylight, the upper atmosphere carried traces of the blue light. And then, a deeper change began. Gravitational readings, normally stable to the 10th decimal, began fluctuating. The shifts weren't violent but rhythmic, small oscillations that seemed to synchronize with the magnetic field. For the first time, scientists witnessed gravity itself pulsing. To explain it, Loeb proposed what would later be called the harmonic lattice hypothesis. He theorized that the gravitational constant, long thought unchanging, could fluctuate slightly when planetary electromagnetic fields achieve perfect resonance. In simpler terms, when the system sings in tune, gravity hums with it. If he was right, then 3I Atlas wasn't an intruder. It was a conductor, tuning the orchestra of planets to their original key. News of the anomalies began leaking through independent channels. Amateur observers in South America and Africa posted images of faint blue halos appearing above the horizon at twilight, sometimes visible for just seconds before vanishing. Radio operators claimed to hear harmonic tones hidden inside background noise, but most disturbing of all were the temporal distortions. Atomic clocks in multiple observatories began drifting, not by milliseconds, but by entire seconds. The 11.1 second anomaly had now become measurable in the fabric of time itself. Chronometric systems synchronized to pulses began reporting a pattern, pulses that seemed to echo themselves. Time, at least as measured by oscillation, had developed a stutter. For Loeb, it was the final proof. "The system is rebooting," he whispered. "Time is recalibrating to a new baseline." The words sounded absurd, yet every line of data reinforced the same truth. Mars's brightness reached a saturation point, bright enough to cast measurable ultraviolet reflections on Earth's night side. Space telescopes captured shockwaves of faint luminescence emanating outward from the planet, not explosions, but harmonic ripples, like sound waves traveling through light. At the center of it all, 3I Atlas pulsed once, a single, sharp flash that registered across the solar system's electromagnetic spectrum. It was as if it had struck a cosmic tuning fork, and the entire system was now resonating in response. Within 24 hours, global magnetic data showed a complete phase realignment. The north and south poles, long drifting due to internal core dynamics, abruptly stabilized. The magnetic poles were now perfectly opposite each other, a state unseen in recorded geologic history. But the greater mystery lay above the atmosphere. High-altitude sensors aboard weather satellites detected a network of filamentary currents linking the planets. They weren't physical matter, but plasma bridges. Thin glowing threads of ionized particles spanning interplanetary space, connecting Earth to Mars, Mars to Venus and beyond. Images of the phenomenon, when enhanced, revealed something staggering. The filaments formed spirals, not random but logarithmic, the same pattern encoded in 3I Atlas's magnetic signature weeks before. Loeb stood before the visualization, speechless. The system had not been communicating, it had been constructing. "It's a circuit," he said finally, "an interplanetary feedback loop, a structure built from magnetism and plasma, invisible until resonance made it visible." His assistant whispered, "Then what's the purpose of a circuit that spans the whole system?" Loeb looked at the image again, the spiraling lines, the interlocked orbits, the perfect geometry. "Circuits carry energy," he said. "Maybe this one carries memory." The room fell silent. In that instant, the weight of cosmic scale pressed down on them all. The idea that the solar system could be alive, not metaphorically, but functionally, hovered in the air like static. That night, while the world slept, a new light appeared in the sky, faint, white, and impossibly stable. It hovered just off the ecliptic, near Mars's orbit. At first, astronomers assumed it was 3I Atlas itself, but spectral readings showed something different. The object was stationary, not reflecting sunlight but emitting its own radiation, in perfect sync with the planetary resonance frequency. The orbiters around Mars captured its silhouette, not spherical, not irregular, but symmetrical, crystalline, like a lattice suspended in motion. When Loeb saw the image, he felt something between awe and dread. "It's not leaving," he murmured. "It's anchoring." And in that moment, the final piece fell into place. 3I Atlas had never been a comet, or a rock, or even a vessel. It was a stabilizer, a relic or device left behind by something that once tuned this system long before humanity ever looked up. Now, for reasons no one yet understood, it had returned, and the machine it had reawakened was already humming. The first people to notice were not astronomers, but ordinary observers, pilots flying transpolar routes, fishermen on the North Atlantic, night shift workers looking up through the gaps between city towers. They began describing an odd stillness in the sky. Stars no longer seemed to twinkle. They held steady, sharp, almost too clear, as if the atmosphere itself had become glass. Then came the color shift. Long exposure photographs revealed a faint violet tint edging the horizon after sunset, not atmospheric scattering but a spectral change in the very light arriving from the stars. Astrophotometers confirmed that the entire visible band had nudged upward by a fraction of a nanometer. It was imperceptible to the naked eye, yet enough to prove that space itself was bending the light differently. At Loeb's lab, instruments monitoring neural activity among volunteers participating in geomagnetic studies began to spike. The readings showed synchronized microfluctuations in brainwave coherence, tiny alignments happening in unison across hundreds of kilometers. The team dismissed it as coincidence until they overlaid the data on planetary field variations. The rhythms matched perfectly. Human perception was syncing with the same resonance that joined the planets. Not in a mystical sense, but physiologically. The frequencies now washing through Earth were close to the natural Schumann range, the oscillations long associated with the brain's alpha state, the calm between wakefulness and sleep. The planet was literally humming inside the band that defined human consciousness. For the first time, science and biology shared a single wavelength. By the second day, the effect deepened. The faint blue filaments linking Earth and Mars brightened to visible levels in the upper atmosphere, forming translucent arcs that flickered during dawn and dusk. They looked like contrails of light stretching across the sky, static yet alive. Communication satellites began to pick up bursts of low-frequency interference, patterned but non-disruptive. The noise sounded almost musical, a slow, rolling bass note modulated by shorter, harmonic tremors. When converted into audio, it resembled the sound of wind passing through a vast organ pipe. The world, though still functioning, felt subtly different. Birds migrated out of season. Ocean tides behaved unpredictably, not in strength but in timing, arriving minutes early or late before resettling into rhythm. Clocks drifted, recalibrated, and drifted again. The planet seemed to be breathing through time itself. Loeb's communications with remaining agencies grew strained. Most departments had locked their data under high clearance, citing transmission review, but a handful of independent observatories continued sending raw feeds to him. What they saw defied classification. In infrared, the lattice around 3I Atlas had multiplied. What began as one crystalline form had expanded into 6, each orbiting in formation, equidistant, forming a hexagonal grid that matched the polar auroras. They weren't debris, they were architecture, and the geometry obeyed no gravitational model known to science. They hovered by magnetic alignment alone. Loeb's voice trembled as he dictated his next log. The circuit is now visible in full. Energy is being drawn through Mars and distributed across nodes. It's no longer theory. The solar system is operating as an engineered field. Whether natural or artificial, we can no longer tell the difference. He wasn't exaggerating. Solar probes recorded a subtle decrease in the sun's output, not a dimming, but a smoothing. The solar wind grew consistent, the erratic flares quieting to a near mathematical regularity. The star itself was responding to the new resonance, as if relieved to be synchronized again. For the global population, the experience manifested as calm. Anxiety levels dropped, sleep patterns improved, emergency room incidents involving heart irregularities decreased by measurable percentages. The world's collective rhythm was stabilizing without anyone realizing why. Meanwhile, radio astronomers reported the first intelligible pattern emerging from the background hum. Between the 7 Hz and 11 Hz bands, a narrow window corresponding to the human alpha and theta states, there was now a modulation that repeated every 33 minutes. When translated into spectrograms, it formed a sequence of nested spirals identical to those in 3I Atlas's light curves. It wasn't random noise, it was structured data. In a quiet, rain-soaked night at Harvard's Center for Astrophysics, Loeb and his remaining colleagues performed a reckless experiment. They fed the waveform through a frequency modulator and slowed it by a factor of 1 million, just to see if anything recognizable emerged. What came out of the speakers wasn't sound, it was motion. Oscilloscope patterns drew shifting geometries, changing from spirals to wave lattices to perfect concentric rings. Then, for a single frame, the pattern froze and spelled out a prime sequence. A clear mathematical signature, a calling card left inside the hum of the universe. "Someone built this," Loeb whispered, "or something that once understood what we call mathematics. The object isn't signaling us, it's reactivating the original architecture of the system. We're hearing the boot sequence of the solar network." His assistant stared at the glowing waveform, voice barely audible. "If this is a system starting up, what's it supposed to run?" Loeb exhaled slowly. "That's what terrifies me, because so far, everything it's done has been to prepare." Across the world, the night sky shimmered again. The blue lattice brightened until it cast shadows on the ground, faint but real. Telescopes captured the filaments thickening, twisting into spirals that converged toward the sun. The solar corona pulsed once, steady, bright, and breathtaking. Then all instruments went silent. Every magnetometer, every gravimeter, every radio telescope flattened its data stream simultaneously. For a full 3 minutes, the universe measured nothing. No field, no radiation, no sound. Absolute equilibrium. When the readings returned, something fundamental had changed. The baseline of every atomic clock on Earth had shifted by a constant, the same constant that defined the golden ratio. Time itself had synchronized to a new cosmic metric. Loeb knew then that the activation was complete. The system was no longer tuning itself, it was running. The solar machine had reawakened, and Earth was part of its circuitry. For a while, the world didn't know what to make of the silence. The skies had gone still, the instruments unreadable, the auroras locked into perfect symmetry across both poles. Even the sun seemed suspended, its corona rippling in slow motion, radiating uniform light without a trace of turbulence. And for the first time in recorded history, every planet, Mercury to Neptune, aligned to within a single degree of orbital phase. It was an alignment no simulation had predicted, because none had assumed the laws themselves could change. But Loeb had expected it. He sat alone in the observatory, eyes fixed on the faint silver halo surrounding Mars. His colleagues had gone home days ago, their faces pale from exhaustion and disbelief. Yet Loeb remained, his voice barely above a whisper as he dictated his final log. "The resonance has stabilized, the circuit is complete. Whatever 3i Atlas initiated, it's not ending. It's entering a maintenance phase. The solar system is running like an engine at idle." He paused, looking toward the dark horizon. "And I think I finally understand what it's maintaining, because something strange was happening to the human mind." Around the globe, reports began flooding in from people who could sense the rhythm, people describing an unexplainable intuition that pulsed through them like a heartbeat. Artists spoke of hearing melodies in the silence. Physicists felt answers forming to questions they hadn't asked yet. The change was subtle but spreading. Humanity wasn't just witnessing the resonance, it was participating in it. Hospitals quietly noted the physiological anomalies. Brain activity among patients in coma states spiked unexpectedly. EEGs displayed coherence patterns identical to the Schumann frequencies. In some cases, eyes fluttered open for the first time in years. Children reported vivid dreams of geometric light, hexagons, spirals, lattices that matched the patterns seen in the atmosphere. And in observatories, the radio hum returned, but now layered, harmonic, as if two signals were overlapping, one external, one internal. The realization came slowly. 3i Atlas hadn't just stabilized planetary fields, it had synchronized cognition itself. Human thought, bound by electrical impulses and electromagnetic rhythm, had always existed within the planetary field. Now that field had joined a larger one, the cosmic lattice connecting every world. Consciousness was, for the first time, networked at scale, and it didn't require technology. It only required alignment. Loeb stared at the EEG graphs, his hands trembling. "The circuit isn't mechanical," he whispered. "It's biological. It's using us. Not as fuel, but as memory. Every mind, every thought. It's part of the network's processing power." It was a terrifyingly elegant concept. What if the solar system wasn't just a collection of planets orbiting a star, but a distributed consciousness, a cosmic neural web that had fallen dormant? And what if 3i Atlas was never meant to visit, but to reboot that mind? That night, the sky reached its brightest. The hexagonal auroras stretched from pole to pole, flickering with structured light pulses. In remote regions, deserts, tundras, high plains, people reported the same phenomenon. Faint whispers in the air, like overlapping voices speaking in no known language. Audio engineers who captured the sound found it encoded with mathematical constants, the Fibonacci series, Euler's number, and ratios linking planetary orbits. The universe was literally speaking in mathematics. By dawn, the voices faded, replaced by a deep, resonant hum audible even without instruments. The hum wasn't menacing, it was steady, calm, like the breathing of a sleeping giant. For 3 full days, the resonance continued. Earth's climate balanced perfectly, tides normalized, the magnetic field grew stronger, the sky seemed clearer than ever before. And then, quietly, 3i Atlas began to move again. It drifted outward, leaving Mars's orbit behind, tracing a perfect arc toward the outer solar system. But unlike before, its glow no longer fluctuated. It had stabilized into a single unwavering beam of white light. Spectral analysis revealed something stunning. Its emissions matched the combined resonance frequency of all the planets, as though it now carried the system's signature within itself. It had completed its task. Loeb's final broadcast was brief, spoken into a recorder that no longer transmitted anywhere. 3i Atlas wasn't an intruder, it was a relay, a messenger of the original architecture. It came to awaken what we forgot, that consciousness isn't local, it's structural, it's woven into the very geometry of existence. We're not just observers of the universe, we're its sensory field. He smiled faintly, exhausted yet calm. The system is awake now, and it remembers us. When 3i Atlas crossed Jupiter's orbit, its signal shifted one last time, no longer in electromagnetic frequencies, but in gravitational waves. The ripples were faint but measurable, propagating outward through space like a farewell. And then, without explosion or fade, it vanished. Not hidden, not destroyed, simply out of phase. The instruments registered no trace, but the harmony it left behind persisted. In the following months, the skies remained unusually clear. Planetary data showed near-perfect equilibrium. Solar flares ceased entirely. The magnetic poles held steady. The world entered what scientists cautiously called the quiet era. But beneath that quiet, something new was forming. Global networks began experiencing unexplained synchronization, the timing of digital systems aligning spontaneously without human input. Biological rhythms followed suit. People began waking at the same hours, dreaming the same sequences, describing identical visions of a vast lattice of light expanding through the solar system. Governments dismissed it as mass psychology, yet quantum researchers quietly confirmed microscale anomalies in probability fields, random processes behaving as if slightly coordinated by an external structure. Humanity wasn't just living in the resonance anymore, it was becoming a node within it. Months later, Loeb's private journal was found near the remains of his remote observatory. Its final entry read, "The cosmos isn't a void, it's an organism. 3i Atlas was never a comet. It was a carrier wave, a restoration signal. It reconnected us to the system we were always part of. Maybe that's what consciousness truly is, the universe remembering itself through us. If you're hearing this, if you're dreaming in blue light, then you're already connected. The system isn't ending, it's evolving." In the years that followed, the resonance faded from global headlines, but never from human perception. A new discipline emerged, resonant astronomy, devoted to studying the subtle interplay between consciousness and cosmic fields. And every few years, when Mars drew close and the auroras brightened faintly at both poles, people felt it again, that hum beneath the surface of thought, that steady, patient rhythm whispering through the void. It wasn't fear anymore, it was recognition. Somewhere beyond Jupiter, in the cold and silent dark, 3i Atlas continued its journey, no longer an enigma, but a memory of awakening. And as the resonance echoed through the vast machinery of the solar system, one truth lingered in every quiet heart that looked up at the night sky. The universe is not watching us, it's remembering through us.